About a month ago, the public beta for Battlefield Hardline ended, bringing closure to one of the most bizarre game reveals in recent years. Hardline went to a public beta just 1 week after its very existence was announced, and the feedback resulted in a 6-month delay to add features that they say will evolve the cops and criminals fantasy into a truly unique Battlefield multiplayer experience. They keep using that word, fantasy. A cops and criminals setting is less of a fantasy than their usual World War III setting. When the cops and criminals have rocket launchers and heavy machine guns and helicopters, it doesn't make the game look like Battlefield, nor does it make it look like a dedicated cops and criminals game. The action is ramped up without the stakes ramping up. It's a mess of features, aesthetics, and gameplay that don't fit the theme it's claiming to fit. What DICE and Visceral have failed to realize is that you can still make an entertaining, mass-marketable, popcorny game with this theme without really having to amp it up to fantasy levels. When I think of how a cops versus robbers game should play out, I don't think of Battlefield. I don't think of Payday's zombie horde mode of cops. I don't think of the high-speed chases and wacky humor of GTA. I think of games that have difficult, demanding gameplay with fast deaths that carry high consequences. I think of games that don't indulge in a gratuitous fantasy of violence, but rather ask the player to respect and fear violence. I think of games like Rainbow Six. And I'm not talking about the cover systems and the regenerating health of the more recent Rainbow Six games, because 15 years ago, this series played very differently from how it does now. In fact, nothing before or after the first 3 Rainbow Six games really compares to them. Because back in 1998, Rainbow Six burst onto the market to slap every other FPS off your shelf and say, no, that's not how it works. Rainbow Six was not a fantasy. It evoked realism. What was unusual for 1998 was that guns had to be reloaded, ammo was not all pooled together, your crosshairs blew up while you were moving, and your strafing and backpedaling were extremely slow. Levels would have 12 enemies instead of 200, and combat began and ended in an instant. But one feature that never became standardized, and also defined the entire experience, was that everybody died in usually one shot. The rules of death were universal for both the good guys and the bad guys, and that meant you had to play carefully. Winning wasn't about dodging bullets and enduring high damage, it was about tactical movement, about prioritizing your sightlines and concentrating on your surroundings as much as possible. It was about strategizing to make sure you had more guns pointed in the direction of bad guys than they had pointed at you. But since every mission pit you against a greater number of them waiting for you, that meant they always had the defensive advantage. It's so unlike any other shooter today, and also from shooters back then. According to IGN, the concept was originally thought up by a programmer, Mustafa Musthamer, who specifically designed it as an antithesis to the usual genre conventions. Back in those days, Red Storm was still heavily influenced by its 2 founders, Tom Clancy and the former submarine commander Doug Littlejohns. Their extensive military knowledge gave the game a tone of authenticity, a hard edge of realism that brought it terribly close to simulator territory. But it was not a sim, it was still a deliberately, elegantly designed game meant for recreation and entertainment first, and that was the key to its success, and it's also why I can't really say that anything before or after Rainbow Six plays quite like it. Unlike Arma, it's not designed as a simulation first. Its AI and controls are complicated, but not that complicated, and unlike Takedown Red Saber, it was not unplayable at launch. Also, unlike both those games, Rainbow Six actually accomplished mainstream success. It sold over 500,000 copies, there were ports to all the major consoles. It was successful enough to garner the attention of Ubisoft, and that's because it appealed to a wide market of players who were fans of different playstyles and different genres. The planning phase has a lot to do with that. It's possible to play Rainbow Six like a strategy game. You can spend hours adjusting your unit's orders, their waypoints, the timing in which they follow waypoints, the speed, aggression, and direction in which they follow waypoints. You can change their loadouts, the team roster, their armor, even the camo pattern on that armor was yet another little adjustable variable that could drastically change the outcome of a game. Plus, it's got that architectural, non-linear style of level design that I've always loved. Despite the primitive 3D, houses in Rainbow Six are designed like houses, with all the different choices of entrances, exits, windows, and balconies that a house would have. Once you're done playing it like a strategy game, you play it like an FPS game, and it was one of the most immersive and tense FPSs of its day. It still is, actually. Last year when I was doing my Tom Clancy video, I reinstalled Rainbow Six and was surprised to find out that it still holds up. I was also surprised to find that it now feels like a skeleton of a game, as far as environmental design goes. Nothing in these maps will move without explicit instructions from the player. Your teammates will not move an inch unless you specifically direct them to during planning. And until then, the enemies are more than happy to sit around and wait you out. But the time invested in that planning phase is mitigated by just how quickly you can jump back and forth between action and planning. And you should do that a lot. There is no quick saving during missions, and there is such an overwhelming amount of choices to be made in the planning phase that it's impossible not to tinker with them all in your repeated attempts to find the perfect plan that works just the way you want it to. Granted, the high difficulty and realism of it all kind of devalues a few of those choices. Since bullet damage is amplified so high, there's little reason not to use the heavy armor, and since most missions are hostage rescue missions where terrorists will kill hostages if they hear gunfire, there's no reason not to use silenced weapons. Throughout the whole game, I don't think I ever used anything other than the silenced MP5. Another one of my own personal rules is that Ding Chavez goes in first and no one is allowed to die until the end game, because death is permanent. You have a limited roster of agents and you really don't want to be stuck with these guys, so the game encourages you to retry missions over and over again until you don't just win them, but win them without taking any casualties. There's a whole lot of trial and error involved, but that's okay. Rainbow Six understands that losing is fun. There's a lot of room to experiment with your playstyle, and since the difficulty is so high, there's a lot of reason to experiment. Finding out how to get good at this game is an incredibly satisfying journey. It's a long, uphill climb that doesn't just lead to victory, but rather to competency. It's amazing how different your playstyle changes over the course of the whole campaign, how you learn to do more with less and to complete missions faster. In the end game, it starts to feel normal to spend only 5 minutes playing a mission, after spending 30 minutes planning a mission. You grow less dependent on the omnipotent heartbeat radar as you learn to scan for predictable hiding spots. You don't necessarily get better at shooting bad guys here. You get better at moving, planning, timing, preparation. You get better at making safe and effective usage of the vast choices available to you. The original Rainbow Six holds up. It remains a very satisfying game to this day, and I highly recommend anyone who hasn't played it to check it out. What's funny is that I actually cut my teeth on this game with the Dreamcast version in 2000. The controls were awkward as hell, but once you got used to them, it played almost exactly like the PC version, which was in stark contrast with the PS1 and N64 ports, which were either heavily compromised or entirely redesigned. And redesigning this game for consoles would become a theme later on. But until then, 2000 also saw the release of Rainbow Six Rogue Spear, which beefed up and polished up the same core gameplay on the same engine. Movement and action got slower thanks to the now necessary lean buttons. The planning phase was beefed up to let you control the direction your teammates face. And it also gave us a textured 3D map for previewing the mission before you went in. It was very iterative, almost the same game as the first, just a whole lot more refined. Weapons actually performed differently enough to incentivize variety. Your teammate AI wasn't completely brain dead, and it is my opinion that this game has the most diverse and enjoyable pack of levels out of the whole series. Shortly after that release, Ubisoft acquired Red Storm and made Rainbow Six 3 happen in 2003, and as good as the previous game was, it did not get better than this. Rainbow Six 3 was not just a graphical overhaul, but also the swan song of the series. The series did not get better than this because it only got worse than this. You had all the complexity and depth of the previous games, but planning was streamlined so that it took less clicks to accomplish the same moves. And there was finally a real-time squad-based ordering system for once. The level and AI design didn't feel so desolate in this one. You could assign team orders and waypoints within the mission. You could improvise new strategies when things went wrong and pull off elaborate tactics that were impossible to do in planning. They also added in a weapon customization system, which was kinda superficial since, once again, there's no reason not to use silencers on everything, but one thing that I really wish caught on was this fluid leaning system where you hold a modifier key and move the mouse to control head movement, and I also love how you can partially open and close doors. It's actually pretty rough playing other shooters after getting used to those two moves. But soon enough, Rainbow Six steadily became like other shooters. Rather than retaining the features that made it unique, the Xbox version of Rainbow Six 3 took away the planning phase, the controllable teammates, the permanently dead teammates, the amplified damage, all those little contributing factors that made it such a nerve-wracking and exciting game were gone. And this was the style that future console versions, and eventually future PC versions, would follow as well. But did I mention that most of the complexity and difficulty of Rainbow Six worked fairly well on the Dreamcast? It's kinda hard to remember that complicated games like these used to be much more mainstream. Rainbow Six shared shelf space next to flight simulators. But over the past 15 years, something about the mainstream consumer's preference has changed, as well as the kind of consumer these games are now made for. Because while the Rainbow Six name is still alive and well, the character of the new games is absolutely nothing like the earlier ones. The Vegas games weren't bad, they were competently made, but they were so much less of a novelty, so much less compelling and involving than the older ones. They didn't fill a unique hole in the market so much as they capitalized on being an alternative to Gears of War. The older games were thinking man shooters in comparison. They required you to slow down and think about the long-term consequences of what you were doing, instead of just having you respond to shooting gallery stimulus. Vegas was where the series swapped out the quiet, slow, and cerebral tone of its brand for a cartoony, high-octane Michael Bay approach to violence that is ultimately more clean and inoffensive than what they started with. But Rainbow Six 1-3 are a hell of a lot more raw. You learn as you play to go into fights ready to react in an instant, to put less lives at risk, and to cause as little damage as possible. The mechanics convey dire consequences for failure. They keep you aware of how fast a flawless plan can go wrong. You learn how to circumvent incredible danger in the safest and most efficient way possible. The older Rainbow Six games teach you to fear and respect violence, but in the new games, you just indulge in a gratuitous fantasy of it.
Tango down!